Hello, you are most welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Real Impartation Moment on Tuesday Night Anatomy with Daniel Okwan. Today's section, we quickly look at the cranial nerves. And remember that in the human body, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, numbered 1 all the way to 12. Yeah, these cranial nerves, they are paired. Yes, of course, that's what they are bilateral. Yes, on either side of the body, we will find them. And we see that most of these cranial nerves will be emerging from what we call the ventral aspect of the brainstem. So essentially, the section I'll be showing you, yes, we'll be looking at what we call the ventral aspect of the brainstem. And then, of course, we know that some of these cranial nerves will be purely sensory in nature. Others will be purely motor. And then, of course, some of them will also present with that kind of mixed nature. Of course, presenting with both sensory and motor supply. Of course, one thing that we hear often, we talk about what we call, the craniosacral outflow being what we call the parasympathetic outflow. And of course, parasympathetic outflow, it means that we are going to utilize what we call parasympathetic nerves. And of course, we know that the sacral portion, yes, will be coming from all the way from S2 to S4. But how about the cranial portion? The cranial portion will be coming from what we call the cranial nerves. But precisely, which portion of what we call the cranial nerves are we going to see these nerves emerging from? Yes, at the end of this session, ladies and gentlemen, we will be able to answer these questions. And so, without much ado, let's set the ball rolling. And so there we are. The first cranial nerve, there's a ventral aspect of the brain stem, essentially. Yes, one thing that you find is that, yes, this is what we call the pons, okay? And then, of course, this is the midbrain, okay? This is what we call the pons, and then we have what we call the medulla oblongata, which extends downwards as what we call the spinal cord. Okay, the first, cranial nerve is not part of the midbrain, essentially. That nerve, okay, is what we call the olfactory nerve. Now, olfactory nerve, the one that you find over here is actually called olfactory tract, okay? Now, the olfactory tract will end as what we call olfactory bulb. And then emerging from this kind of olfactory bulb will be the axons of the cranial nerve 1, okay, going, okay, to what we call the upper portion of the nasal cavity, carrying that kind of sensation from that region, because of course we know that the upper portion of the nasal cavity, okay, will contain what we call olfactory mucosa. And of course we know that olfaction is for smelling. That is why this nerve is called olfactory nerve. And because it's for smelling, sensation only, this is a purely, sensory nerve. The next nerve that we want to see, yes, we want to see where it is originating from. But the structure that you find over here, almost in the midline, yes, midline over here, is what we call optic asthma. This is optic asthma. Now, optic asthma represents what we call the structure, okay, where there's that kind of decreasation of what we call the optic nerves, nerve fibers will take place. And of course, optic nerves, because it's for vision, it is also a purely, sensory, nerve. Okay, and one thing is that nerve, yes, because there's that kind of decreasation. Now remember that this portion, okay, because we are looking at the ventral aspect, okay, the ventral, that's the anterior aspect of the brainstem. What is happening is that this becomes a left portion of it, and this is the right portion of it. And you can see that these nerves, yes, some will be coming from the left side, others will be coming from the left side. So they are bilateral, as we said, they are paired. And so what we are saying is that if the nerve is coming from what we call the olfactory nerve fibers will be coming from, what we call the left side, they will be decreasing in this region to emerge towards the right side, okay, and then vice versa. Okay, so that is what we see. This is olfactory, what we call, optic asthma. And of course, from optic asthma, emerging upwards, we find what we call the optic nerves. Okay, that is what I want you to know. Now, the next nerve that we find over here, okay, is in a fossa. Okay, this fossa, okay, is called interpeduncular fossa. Now, what you find over here, this the structure that you find over here, okay, the one I'm trying to show you over here, these are what we call cerebral peduncles. Okay, these are what we call cerebral peduncles. And therefore, the cerebral peduncle, this area, okay, because it's found between these two cerebral peduncles, we call this area interpeduncular fossa. Interpeduncular fossa. Now, the only cranial nerve that emerges, okay, from the interpeduncular fossa is what we call the oculomotor nerve. Oculomotor nerve. Now, look at the name. The name is oculomotor nerve. So it makes sense that it is a purely, motor nerve. Okay, oculomotor nerve. That's the only nerve, okay, of what we call the interpeduncular fossa coming from the midbrain. Okay, that is the nerve coming from the midbrain. okay, from the interpeduncular fossa. Yes, not only this nerve we find the interpeduncular fossa, but of course we also have this thing which we call the stalk of the pituitary. That's the infundibulum portion. Yes, and of course if I look over here, I find what we call the mammillary bodies, okay, portion of the limbic system. Okay, that's also there. And then over here we have what we call posterior perforating substance. Now one thing that we know is that these ones, forming what we call contents of the interpeduncular fossa, also form the floor of what we call the fourth ventricle, sorry, the third ventricle. Okay, so that is what we find over here. So that's the only nerve. So there's a motor nerve. Of course we know that to be supplying these kind of extraocular muscles. Yes, that is what we find. Now from what we call, from that region, the most slender nerve that we find, okay, this nerve, the next nerve that we'll be seeing, they will be essentially be coming from what we call the this area, which we call it, it's emerging. Now look at this one. This is the midbrain, and then of course this is the pons. Okay, that nerve which will be coming from the posterior aspect, from the dorsal aspect, okay, of what we call the midbrain, the dorsal aspect of the midbrain. Okay, this one came from the ventral aspect, but this one is coming from behind the midbrain. Okay, that is the trochlear nerve. And remember that the trochlear nerve, yes, as far as its thickness is concerned, is very slender, very thin nerve which will be emerging from the dorsal aspect of the midbrain. Okay, that's the only nerve you find over here, the trochlear nerve. Of course, we've heard of this kind of SO4. The trochlear nerve is the fourth cranial nerve. It is also motor in nature, because to be supplying one of these extraocular muscles, okay, that is superior oblique muscle, SO4, that one, trochlear nerve. Now the remaining nerves will be emerging from here. Okay, now the only nerve, okay, which will be coming from this area, which of course we say is the pons, is what we call the trigeminal nerve. Okay, the only nerve which emerges from the pons is what we call the trigeminal nerve. Okay, the thickest cranial nerve that we have. Okay, that is what we find, the trigeminal nerve. Okay, that's the only nerve which will be coming from, of course, this kind of pons. Okay, so that is what we find. Now the remaining nerves which I'm going to talk about, they will be in that kind of sequence. Okay, now this area is the midline. Okay, of course we know that this one over here will be the basilar sulcus. Okay, such that basilar groove, for instance, the basilar artery will be running over here. Okay, so that's what we see. So there's the midline. Now emerging from the midline, so I'm going to go from medial to lateral. There will be some three important nerves which I'm going to show you from medial to lateral. And then the medial one, okay, the medialmost one is what we call the abducens nerve. The abducens nerve. Yes, of course, we know that abducens nerve is also one of the muscles supplying what we call the extraocular muscle. Therefore, it's also motor. It's supplying, yes, we talk about LR6, lateral rectus. Okay, so this abducens nerve is what we call the sixth cranial nerve. The sixth cranial nerve. Okay, that is what we find. Then if I move lateral to what we call this abducens nerve, then I will see another nerve emerging. That nerve is what we call the facial nerve, the seventh cranial nerve, facial nerve. Okay, of course we know that the facial nerve is going to be, it's going to be a mixed nerve, but that's one thing that you have to know about the facial nerve, that it is going to be a mixed nerve. Okay, having a thick portion being motor and then the small portion over here being sensory, so it's a mixed nerve. And then even lateral to that one, we are going to have what we call vestibular cochlear nerve. Of course, the nerve is very relevant as far as hearing and balancing, are concerned. Now these three nerves, namely abducens nerve, yes, facial nerve, and vestibular cochlear nerve, yes, or cranial nerve 6, cranial nerve 7, and cranial nerve 8, they are not emerging from the pons. Neither are they emerging from medulla oblongata, but they are emerging from that junction between these two. Okay, that's what we call pontomedullary junction. Pontomedullary junction from medial to lateral. 6, 7, 8. Okay, that is what we see. Now, if we look at this vestibular cochlear nerve, yes, it's essentially going to be sensory, but it may have some kind of motor, fibers as well. Okay, that is what I want you to know. Yes, of course, we know facial nerve is a mixed nerve because, of course, the teeth, for instance, coming from anterior two-thirds of the tongue by way of the chorda tympanic branch of it. Yes, it's also going to supply these kind of muscles of facial expression. Okay, that is what we see. Now, the remaining nerves that we find, yes, we are going to now go to what we call the medulla oblongata. Now, in the medulla oblongata, we see this, structures very close to the midline. Okay, these structures are what we call pyramid. Okay, pyramid. These structures are what we call the pyramid. And then even lateral to pyramid, we have this kind of elevation over here that is called olive. And this olive is due to, that kind of elevation over there is due to what we call, deep width. We have what we call inferior olivary nucleus. We'll create this kind of, elevation. So what we are saying is that we have pyramid, okay, medial, and lateral to pyramid, I have olive. Okay, now one thing is that I'm interested in the olive because lateral to the olive, I will see 3 nerves emerging from superior to inferior, or from cranial to the caudal region. And what are these 3 nerves? Yes, the first one over here is what we call the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossopharyngeal nerve. And we talk about glossopharyngeal nerve, you are talking about cranial nerve 9. Yes, we ended at cranial nerve 8, which was vestibular cochlear nerve. Now we go to cranial nerve 9. Okay, glossopharyngeal nerve. And one thing that we know is that this glossopharyngeal nerve is also a mess nerve, because at the end of the day, it may be carrying that kind of taste from what you call, the posterior one, one third of the tongue, from the soft palate, for instance. Yes, not only that, yes, it will also be giving that kind of secretomotor pathway to, the parotid gland, for instance. Okay, so that is one thing. It is a mess nerve. Then as I go downwards, I find this nerve 2, which is cranial nerve 10, okay, which is, the vagus nerve, okay, the vagus nerve, this one, cranial nerve 10. Yes, cranial nerve 10 is also a mess nerve, that's what we find over here. Then as I go downwards, I find what we call the accessory nerve. Yes, of course, we know accessory nerve. We have what we call cranial accessory, we have spinal accessory. This is what we call the accessory nerve, and accessory nerve is the 11th, because vagus nerve is the 10th. Accessory nerve becomes what we call the 11th cranial nerve. So I said we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So we've seen 11 of these ones. Now how about the 12th one? The 12th one, yes, essentially is giving that kind of motor supply to the tongue. Okay, now remember that accessory nerve, okay, is also motor nerve in nature, right? Accessory nerve is motor, and this nerve will be supplying, this hypoglossal nerve will be supplying this kind of what we call tongue muscles. Okay, and that is why it is also motor. And this cranial nerve 12, where you are going to find it is that you are going to find it between between what we call pyramid and of course olive. That nerve emerging from the ventral aspect of the brain stem, that area is known as the hypoglossal nerve. So these are the nerves, the 12 pairs of cranial nerves that we have in the human body. Now one thing that we have to know, which we said was part of our objective today, was that yes, if we talk about this kind of craniosacral outflow, that's the parasympathetic outflow. Now the cranial nerves which are parasympathetic in nature are what we call the cranial nerve 3, that's the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 7, okay, and cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve, cranial nerve 9, okay, that is what we call glossopharyngeal nerve, and cranial nerve 10 being what we call the vagus nerve. So these are the nerves, we call them parasympathetic nerves. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of this section. I hope you find it helpful. In future editions of these ones, we will be taking these kind of cranial nerves individually, and we will talk at length about these ones. I'm very grateful for your time this evening. Have a good night, all of you, and may the good Lord richly bless you. Amen.